Hi there, welcome to ACE Anatomy. I am Dr. Divya DSa. Ever wondered what keeps our brain cushioned and nourished? Well, meet the ventricles, a hidden network of fluid-filled chambers within our brain. In this video, I will break down their anatomy step by step for your easy understanding. If you are new to my channel, hit the subscribe, ring the bell, and let's dive in right away. So let's begin with the basic understanding of the ventricles of brain. The ventricles are ependymal-lined fluid-filled spaces in the different parts of the brain. We have a pair of lateral ventricles, the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. So what is the function of these ventricles? Why do we have the ventricles in our central nervous system? So these ventricles, they produce, circulate and absorb the CSF, which cushions and protects the brain and spinal cord. Let's now first understand the development of the ventricles. At the cranial end of the neural tube, three primary brain vesicles are formed: the prosencephalon or forebrain, the mesencephalon or the midbrain, and rhombencephalon or the hindbrain. And from these three primary vesicles, we have five secondary brain vesicles. The prosencephalon divides to form the telencephalon and diencephalon, and the rhombencephalon divides to form the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. So from these five secondary brain vesicles, the different parts of the brain are formed. From telencephalon, we have the cerebral hemispheres being formed. And from the diencephalon, we have the thalamus, metathalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus and epithalamus formed. The midbrain remains as the midbrain, forms the midbrain, whereas the metencephalon forms the pons and the myelencephalon forms the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. So within this neural tube, the cavity of that neural tube, as these brain vesicles are formed and the adult derivatives are formed, this cavity remains as the ventricles. So the cavity of this telencephalon, we call it as the lateral ventricle. The cavity of diencephalon, we call it as the third ventricle. The cavity here of the midbrain, we call it as cerebral aqueduct. And the cavity of the rhombencephalon, we call it as fourth ventricle. Let us study the lateral ventricle. So there are two lateral ventricles, one in each cerebral hemisphere. And each lateral ventricle is roughly C-shaped cavity situated within each cerebral hemisphere. The lateral ventricle wraps itself around the thalamus, the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus. The cavity of the lateral ventricle is lined by ependymal cells and it is filled with CSF with a capacity of about 7 to 10 ml. This is the coronal section of the cerebral hemispheres. So here we can see that the main part of the lateral ventricle is separated by a septum known as the septum pellucidum, which extends from the corpus callosum above to the fornix below. This is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere showing the septum pellucidum. So what is this septum pellucidum? Septum pellucidum is a thin vertical sheath of nervous tissue consisting of grey and white matter, and it is covered on either side by the ependymal cell. For descriptive purpose, the lateral ventricle is divided into four parts: the anterior horn, the posterior horn, the inferior horn and the central part of the body. Now the central part of the body, it lies mostly within the parietal lobe and it will extend from the interventricular foramen here in the front to the splenium of the corpus callosum behind. That is, this is the interventricular foramen. From here to the splenium of the corpus callosum behind. This is the corpus callosum. Then the anterior horn. This is the anterior horn. It is the anterior extension from the central part into the frontal lobe. So it will extend into the frontal lobe. And it lies in front of the interventricular foramen and behind the posterior, so this is the interventricular foramen, so lies in front of the interventricular foramen and behind the genu of the corpus callosum. Then the posterior horn, this is the posterior horn. It is the backward extension from the central part into the occipital lobe, that is towards the occipital pole. So it will be extending here behind towards the occipital pole. This inferior horn, it is the direct continuation of the main ventricular cavity into the temporal lobe. So it will be extending down here into the temporal lobe. And this inferior horn, it is the largest of the three horns. So it begins where the central part and the posterior horn will meet, and it will curve around the pulvinar of the thalamus. So that will be around this region. And it will extend into the temporal lobe to end about 2.5 centimeters behind the temporal pole. So each of these lateral ventricle will communicate with the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen of Monro. And remember that most of the CSF in the CNS is produced by the choroid plexus of the two lateral ventricles. Before we try to understand the boundaries of the different parts of lateral ventricle, let's understand the coronal section of cerebrum. So here the cerebrum will have the outer cortex, which is made up of grey matter, and the inner white matter, within which there are embedded collection of grey matter, which are in the form of nuclei. So here these two cerebral hemispheres, in between that we have the longitudinal, median longitudinal fissure here. Below that, here we have the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum are the largest commissural fibers which connects the two cerebral hemispheres. This is the lateral ventricle, and in between here we have the septum pellucidum. This is the thalamus, and here we have the third ventricle. Here the hypothalamus and the subthalamic nucleus are present. On the lateral side here we will see the caudate nucleus, the putamen and the globus pallidus, which together, that is the putamen and the globus pallidus, together we call them as the lentiform nucleus. So they belong to the basal ganglia. Let us now understand the corpus callosum, since the corpus callosum forms the major boundary of the lateral ventricle. The corpus callosum, they are the largest commissural fibers connecting the cerebral cortex of the two cerebral hemispheres. So this corpus callosum is divided from before backwards into four parts, that is the rostrum, the genu, the body or the trunk, and the splenium. So the genu here, it is the thick curved anterior extremity of corpus callosum, and it will be about 4 centimeters behind the frontal pole. The rostrum, it extends downwards and backwards as a thin prolongation to join the lamina terminalis. And the body here or the trunk, it is the main middle part of the corpus callosum. Between its thick, that is the genu, anterior genu, and posteriorly splenium. So between that we have the body or the trunk. And the splenium is the massive posterior extremity of the corpus callosum. It lies about 6 centimeters in front of the occipital pole. Let's now understand the fibers of corpus callosum. So anteriorly from the genu, the fibers, they sweep forwards into this frontal lobe, anterior part of the frontal lobe, to form a fork-like structure, and this is called as the forceps minor. Posteriorly from the splenium, the fibers, they sweep backwards above the calcarine sulcus, forming the forceps major. Now this forceps major, it forms a swelling in the upper part of the medial wall of posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, and that forms the bulb of the posterior horn. Then behind that we can see this tapetum. So it is the thin lamina of white fibers about 2 centimeters thick. It forms the roof as well as the lateral wall of the posterior horn, and as well as the lateral wall of the inferior horn too. So what is this tapetum? This tapetum basically is formed by those fibers of the trunk as well as from the splenium which are not crossed by the corona radiata. Now corona radiata are actually the fibers which fan out rostrally coming from the internal capsule. Let's now look at the boundaries of the central part of the lateral ventricle. Now central part is also called the body, and this is triangular in shape in coronal section with having a medial wall, a roof and a sloping floor. So the roof is formed by the undersurface of the corpus callosum. So we can see it here better in a schematic diagram. This is the central part of corpus callosum, or otherwise known as the trunk of the corpus callosum, which forms the roof. The floor here slopes from lateral to medial side, and it is formed by the body of caudate nucleus, the striae terminalis, the thalamostriate vein, the lateral part of the upper surface of the thalamus, the choroid plexus covering the medial part of the upper surface of thalamus, and the upper surface of the body of fornix. The medial wall here is formed by the septum pellucidum. The anterior horn, otherwise called as the frontal horn since it projects into the frontal lobe, is roughly triangular in coronal section, and it presents a roof, a floor, medial wall and a lateral wall. So here the roof is formed by the undersurface of the anterior part of the body of corpus callosum. The narrow floor is formed by the upper surface of the rostrum of the corpus callosum. The anterior wall in the front will be formed by the genu of the corpus callosum. The medial wall is formed by the septum pellucidum, and the lateral wall is formed by the bulging head of the head of caudate nucleus. The posterior horn, also called the occipital horn, is quadrangular or diamond shaped in coronal section. It has a roof, lateral wall and the floor, and a medial wall. This is the medial wall. The roof, the lateral wall as well as the floor is formed by the tapetum, that is the sheet of fibers from the splenium as well as the part, that is the body of the corpus callosum, which is not crossed by corona radiata, which we saw earlier. The medial wall here is formed by two ridges. One is in the upper part, we see the forceps major, which forms the bulb. It is basically the swelling formed by the forceps major fibers, which forms the bulb of the posterior horn. And in the lower part, we see the calcar avis. Calcar avis is the prominent elevation of the white matter, which is produced by the anterior part of the calcarine sulcus. The inferior horn in coronal section appears as a transverse slit presenting a roof and a floor. The lateral part of the roof is formed by the tapetum, whereas the medial part is formed by the tail of caudate nucleus and striae terminalis. Striae terminalis is the white matter which forms the major output from the amygdala. The floor here from lateral to medial side, we will see the collateral eminence. First is this collateral eminence on the lateral side, which is an elongated swelling. It is produced by the collateral sulcus. Next to that, medially here, we will see the hippocampus. So this is another longitudinal elevation which will lie parallel and medial to this collateral eminence. The fibers of the hippocampus here, it will form a thin sheet of white matter called alveus, and it will cover the ventricular surface of the hippocampus. And these fibers, that is of the alveus, they will converge medially to form a ridge which is known as fimbria. And most medially here in the floor, we have this choroid plexus here. So this will pass into the inferior horn through the choroid fissure which lies between the fimbriae below, okay, and the striae terminalis and the tail of the caudate nucleus above. Now let's understand the choroid plexus of lateral ventricle. Now on the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, along the C-shaped line between the diencephalon and the hemisphere, the medial wall of both this central part as well as the inferior horn of lateral ventricle is made up of only ependymal cells. These ependymal cells are covered by the pia mater to form the tela choroidae. And now this tela choroidae along this C-shaped line is invaginated by the fringe-like tuft of blood vessels into the central part and the inferior horn to form the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle. And this line of invagination of the choroid plexus into the lateral ventricle is called choroid fissure. The choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle is derived from the anterior choroidal artery, a branch of internal carotid artery, and the posterior choroidal artery, which is a branch of posterior cerebral artery. Now let's summarize the lateral ventricle. So the lateral ventricles are the cavities of the telencephalon which forms the cerebral hemispheres. So these lateral ventricles are a pair which are separated by the septum pellucidum, which is a thin sheet of nervous tissue. These lateral ventricles, they communicate with the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen of Monro. The lateral ventricles, they produce most of the CSF in the CNS. And each of these lateral ventricle has four parts: the anterior horn, the central part, the posterior horn and the inferior horn. The inferior horn is the largest and the longest of the three horns. The posterior horn is the recent in evolutionary scale of among the three horns. And the area where this inferior horn and the posterior horn, they diverge, that we call it as the collateral trigone. That brings us to the end of lateral ventricle. In the subsequent videos, I will discuss the anatomy of third and fourth ventricle. So stay tuned and don't forget to like, subscribe and share. Until next time.